Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know it's a long week for everybody. Welcome, everyone, to the International Aquaculture Law and Policy Symposium. My name is Megan Senatori, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. We are located in Portland, Oregon, in the United States, for those of you who may not know us. So we're delighted to join the international community today here at the University of Birmingham. And I have to say, I'm very excited to see so many students and animal alums from Lewis and Clark who are here with us. So together with our co-hosts, the Aquatic Life Institute and the Multi-Species Collective, we have an exciting day planned for you, featuring some of the world's leading experts in aquaculture law and policy. Aquaculture, or the industrial farming of aquatic animals, now accounts for more than 50% of global aquatic animal food production. And that number is only growing, with more species and more animals being added to the hundreds of billions of individual animals that are being intensively farmed in confinement around the world. Our collective goal for this event is to foster an essential discussion and to raise awareness about the complex web of laws and policies that regulate the animal aquaculture industry. We will also be discussing where the law is failing to keep pace with industry expansion and what we can all collectively do about it. You can find the full schedule on the QR code and also at the doors. I think we are probably going to run out of time today because we have a really ambitious schedule. So I want to do our thank yous here at the outset. It's been a really invigorating experience, to say the least, planning the event. So we're really, really grateful to have had a lovely collaborative team to work with at the Aquatic Life Institute, including Tessa Gonzalez and Julia Malherbe, and at the Multi-Species Collective, including Dr. Iyan Offor. And then on the Cal side, I'd like to say a special thank you to my wonderful colleagues here, Jaleel and Danielle Lopez, for all of their hard work making the symposium possible. And then we are also grateful to the University of Birmingham for use of this beautiful space, and as well as for the outstanding support of their events team and the AV team that's here for us today. So with that, I'd like to invite Megan Campbell. You get a Megan and a Megan today at the University of Birmingham Law School. She is their deputy dean to help join me in welcoming you.
Good morning, everyone. I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to Birmingham Law School and to the University of Birmingham, and to some of you welcome you to the City of Birmingham and to the UK. We are delighted that you're all here. We pride ourselves on being a really rich academic home for the study of law, particularly thinking about law in its socio-legal context and its larger thinking of law in new and exciting ways. And I'm just delighted that you're all here to talk about the aquatic culture, law, and policy. We hope it's a wonderful home for the day for the conference. I would really encourage you, it's so sunny today, to make sure to take a stroll around our beautiful campus. You can see that it's not only a rich intellectual home, but it's also a beautiful physical home. For those who are pop culture junkies, the tower, you'll see the tower, you can't miss it, it's a big tower. It was inspiration for the tower in the Lord of the Rings. So if you're a big Lord of the Rings junkie, that can be a nice inspirational walk to invigorate your afternoon discussions. Unfortunately, it's an aquatic culture conference. It's actually birds who live up there right now, not any aquatic life, but I hope that doesn't detract you too much. I understand there might be a chance to go for a walk in the gardens later, and I know you have, hopefully some of you have an evening here where you could go explore our wonderful city. We think of it as a real hidden gem. And for those who watch Peaky Blinders, more pop culture, Digbeth is the area that inspired that. So when you've tired out your intellectual brains, please make sure to enjoy some of the rich offerings the city has. And lastly, I think perhaps most importantly, congratulations to you all for the wonderful conference. Many of us in the room have probably organized conferences in the past. It is a tremendous amount of work and effort and skill to bring everyone together so seamlessly. So big congratulations to the organizers on all their hard work. And I really hope the day is fruitful and enjoyable for you all. And we are just so delighted that you're all here. And I hope you have a wonderful conference.
While I bring up the first panel, I'm going to add to the pulp culture references. I learned that Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning was also filmed in Birmingham, although not on the campus. So apparently at the city center, the chase scene for anybody who's seen it. So why don't we bring up the first panel? So I have Kathy and Claire and Daina, and Iyan is going to moderate. Thank you, everybody. We are, just a note before we turn it over to them, we are recording today's event. There will be time for Q&A, and we just wanted to note when we are recording that, or when you are doing the Q&A, that it will be recorded. So, thank you. Would you maybe introduce here and then, yeah, but whatever you prefer.
All right, thanks, Megan. Well, I'm so happy to get this first panel started. I'm so looking forward to today. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel, which is on aquaculture, animals, the environment, and public health. This panel examines how aquaculture intersects with animal welfare, animal ethics, climate change, and human health. So a brief word on the structure you can expect from this panel. We'll start with a 20-minute Aquaculture 101. Kathy will be speaking for about 10 minutes to introduce us to the central issues that we'll be discussing throughout the day. We'll then have a 10-minute conversation with our other panelists to broaden that out. Then in part two, we'll have a broader and deeper conversation, speaking to aquatic animals, the environmental and public health impacts of aquaculture. So we'll have presentations from Daina and from Clair, a 20-minute roundtable discussion, and then a 20-minute Q&A that you can all participate in. So I'd like to begin by introducing our three panelists. We have Kathy Hessler. Kathy is the Assistant Dean for Animal Law and the Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at the George Washington University Law School. We have Daina Bray. Daina is the Legal Director of the Law, Environment and Animals program at Yale Law School, where she's a clinical lecturer in law and leads the Climate Change and Animal Agriculture Legal Initiative. And we have Clair Linzey. Clair is the Deputy Director of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics. She's a Research Fellow in Animal Ethics at Wycliffe Hall in the University of Oxford, and the Francis Power Cobb Professor of Animal Theology at the Graduate Theological Foundation, USA. Before I turn over to our panelists for their presentations and conversation, I'd like to share very briefly that I'm particularly delighted to be co-hosting this event and moderating this panel, given the triple emphasis on aquatic animals, the environment, and public health, which very much mirrors the approach that we take to the research, creative, and activist work we do within the Multi-Species Collective. I'm realizing I failed to introduce myself. My name, I've been here for 2 days, so I'm thinking everyone knows me. So my name is Dr. Iyan Offor. I'm the founding leader of the Multi-Species Collective and an assistant professor in environmental law at the University of Birmingham, so here on campus. So in moderating this panel, I thought it might be useful to share a very simple three-part framework that we might use to think about aquaculture issues, rooted in thinking in multi-species flourishing that we work with in the collective. Would we be able to advance the slide? Can I do that here?
And there's a clicker for you. I think I left it right up.
Yes.
Yep, there you go. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. This is not what I'm looking for. So a very simple three-part framework that we could use to think about the issues that we'll be speaking about today. Thank you. Great. So as ecological and social challenges are intensifying across the globe, there's a need for new ways of thinking, acting, and relating to one another, and this has never been more urgent. In the collective, we work with multi-species ways of thinking, acting, and relating as a promising way forward, grounded in care, flourishing, and mutual interdependence. Multi-species approaches reframe the foundations of our knowledge, our methods, and our worldviews that are in turn shaping our work. So there are three key ways in which we can forward multi-species thinking that you may want to consider today. First, we can question or problematize the human-centered nature of our work and our ways of being and living in the world. Second, we can regard the knowledges, experiences, and life worlds of other than human life to be significant. And third, we can adopt a worldview, perspective, and methods and approaches to our work that pay close attention to the entanglements and relations of different forms of life on Earth. So I will leave that with you to consider as I hand over now to our first panelist, Kathy, who will be presenting for 10 minutes. Over to you, Kathy.
I just want to sit because I understand. Whatever you want. I'm going to do yeah, we could each do
Would you like to stand?
I think we could each do whatever. I don't know. Okay. I'll probably stand. Okay, and I'll do that. Trying to develop consensus on approach. Okay, and the clicker's here.
Just here.
Good morning to everyone. So I'm here to talk about
aquaculture very quickly. We recognize that some people in the room have deep knowledge about aquaculture and some people might be new to the topic. So I'm just going to very briefly go over these 4 topics. So who are the animals? What is the science? Or that there is science? What are the practices and the lack of legal regulation? So first job is seeing these animals, right? We're not sort of trained to see these animals and to even recognize who is an aquatic animal. So trying to lift them up. These are the categories of aquatic animals, and I'll just share with you, as I do with my students, that when I was in school, I didn't even know some of these categories, right? I didn't know they existed, or I didn't know who belonged in them, and I certainly wasn't thinking about them. So the first thing we need to do is just sort of survey, right? Who are the animals in these contexts? Who are the beings? And then we can begin to learn to know them and figure out what protections they need. So these are just some slides to show you who they are, what they look like. And you can see the incredible diversity. So when we think about terrestrial animal farming, we have far fewer species we're trying to learn to deal with, and the diversity of biological reality for these animals is far more vast. Okay, so why do these animals matter? Well, obviously they matter for themselves, and they matter for species survival, and they matter for the environment, and if necessary to make a strategic argument, they matter for us, right? Okay, so when we see and understand them, we begin to see the holes and why there are holes in our ability to protect them. And so one of the reasons that we don't protect them is because we don't see them, as I've said, right? So that invisibility itself becomes a legal problem because we literally do not see them. And so that lack of interaction results in a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy, and a lack of protection. We also tend to focus on the charismatic megafauna, right? So the whales and the dolphins and the sea turtles, which is great. We want to protect them. And we want to protect the other animals who might not be as cute or cuddly or attractive. And so another reason we don't protect them is we think they exist in uncountable numbers. So we, as a species, tend to think we can exploit these animals and it won't matter, right? Because there's more of them. Plenty of fish in the sea, as they say, right? Which is, of course, not true. And so we also, therefore, discount the value of individuals because we see them as collectives. And so we need to protect them. We need to also begin to think about the alternatives to their uses. And we are doing more of that, but we'll talk about that throughout the day because it's really pretty possible. We're already on the way to developing alternatives to the numbers of uses that we put these animals to. Okay, so the science and the sentience. So these are just a list of the kinds of capacities that science has shown us some of the aquatic animals have. I'm not suggesting that there's a species that has all of these capacities, but that species have these capacities. And what this says to me, well, I'm not a scientist, and Becca can tell me if I'm saying it incorrectly, but as a lawyer, what this tells me is animals have plenty of capacities, and I now think we should just presume that they have capacities, right? One of the problems is in the scientific to legal conversation, we wait for proof. So that means science has to have decided to engage on the inquiry whether a particular species has a particular capacity and then proving it yes or no, rather than starting from a default position. And I understand scientifically why that happens, but it becomes problematic legally. So these animals have all passed what's called the mirror self-recognition test. And so that's a cognitive test that many human 2- and 3-year-olds are beginning to be able to pass, which is just to say that they recognize that they are an individual differentiated from other individuals. I mean, I think it's a proof issue conversation, not that beings don't have this capacity. It's a question of whether we know how to test for it and whether we have tested for it. So obviously pain, cognition, sentience, we've been talking about that for the folks who've been here the last couple of days quite a lot, but those are capacities that the law begins to find legally cognizable. So the science, we have new scientific sort of approaches. So we have the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness and the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, and these are structures where we can be led by the scientists who say, yes, animals have these capacities, and therefore the lawyers can take that on and say we need therefore to protect them. There's also something called the precautionary principle that says basically before we engage in activity, if we think it might cause harm, we should go slow, we should see if there's alternatives, we should see if there's ways to minimize that harm before we engage in this new activity. And so my suggestion is that these scientific sort of understandings should port into legal protection and legal frameworks for protection, right? So we should incorporate the precautionary principle. We should take seriously our existing duty to avoid unnecessary harm and suffering. And we need to create for ourselves a duty not only to use alternatives, but to develop alternatives to the use of animals. And we need to shift our defaults, right? Okay, so what does aquaculture look like? So these are some of the styles of aquaculture. So depending on the species, depending on the geography, the systems are quite different. So some are fully on land, some are adjacent to land in streams or rivers, some are in near ocean or open ocean. So it just depends on the systems. So these are some more pictures to just give you a sense, frankly, to give you a sense of the scale of these operations, right? These are single operations, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of beings stuck in these every year. And you can see literally factory settings, right? This is a factory facility. And you can imagine what these beings are experiencing. So the FAO suggests that about 94 million tons of aquatic animals are produced, and that's not fishing, that's not the wild caught or capture industry. And these are somewhat dated. The new figures should be out later this month, hopefully. So the rise in number of the use of these animals is significant, and I'll show you that in a second, but also the discard. So we're raising these animals, we're fishing other animals out of the oceans to feed to these animals, and yet 35% of these animals are wasted. They don't go for their intended purpose. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions, right, of animals. And they're measured in tonnage, they're not measured as individuals, and that's a significant problem. So this is just a chart that shows you the reddish hues are the marine and inland water aquaculture. So you can see the rise in production, and that is going to continue by all predictions. Okay, so the harms, and again, we'll be talking about this all day, so I'm just gonna highlight categories of harms. So physical and psychological suffering, cannibalism, because we are now farming animals who are carnivores, right? And so we don't have cows tending to eat one another because they're herbivores. And so this is the first time at scale we are farming carnivorous animals, which means they're used to eating other animals, and they will eat one another under stress conditions. Some animals will even begin to eat their own limbs if that's accessible to them, octopus. So sea lice, disease, deformity, inappropriate food, housing, and medical care, and the harms to non-captive animals that are affected by this industry are also important to take into account. Environmentally, we're talking about pollution, and that includes antibiotics, pesticides, waste, plastics. We have disease, we have contamination, we have ecosystem degradation, we have overfishing, climate change, we have worker safety, welfare, and consumer public health and safety issues. So these, again, are just some pictures to show you what the waste from an aquaculture facility looks like. That's blood from a salmon facility, and they just put it into the ocean. And that, not only is it blood, but it's polluted, right, with antibiotics or pesticides or other potentially disease. These are the methods of slaughter. In the United States, there is no US federal, meaning national or state law that regulates how these animals are killed. None. So that means we have very little legal regulation. And where we have some regulation for animals, aquatic animals and animals in aquaculture are often doubly exempted. They're exempted because they fall into the category of farmed animals, and they're exempted because they fall into the category of aquatic animals, who are often not covered by our regulations. So clearly we need new regulations. There are some that we'll probably be talking about throughout the day, But it's important to know even with regulation, good welfare is not possible, and it's a broken system. So there is evolving legal conceptualization of animals generally, trying to move them out of the property category so that they can have some protections in different jurisdictions under different rubrics. So this is just a list of some of the sort of efforts underway around the globe to change how we look at animals in the legal system. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for a very, very informative start to our day, outlining some of the key problems that we'll need to be facing together. So I'd now like to turn us to a 10-minute discussion between our panelists to elaborate on what Kathy has introduced. And I'll start with a question that's for both Daina and Claire to bring you into the discussion. For you, what would you consider to be some of the most salient and challenging features of aquaculture, whether practices, harms, or legal loopholes, that for you, you think we ought to carefully consider in our discussions today?
Well, I think I'd like to emphasize one of the things that Kathy briefly wandered over, and I'm not going to get to in my talk, which is, I think, the sheer scale of it. So in 1970, about 5% of fish consumed or aquatic animals consumed were farmed. Now that's roughly half. And so it's grown exponentially. And when an industrial practice like that grows so rapidly, one of the things that I'll come on to talking about, but affects Daina and Kathy as well, is that that's when profit means that we are going to be concerned less about the beings themselves, we're going to be concerned less about the workers, and we're going to be much less concerned about the environment. So I feel like that's one thing I'd like to add. And also I think I want to say that in fairness to people who began these activities, the science came out after the practices began, right? So the science came in around the 2000s, and so we are all playing catch up with this industry, I think is where I'd like to begin. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Daina?
Yeah, I would just add to that, again, picking up on a couple of the themes that Kathy emphasized. The hidden nature of these animals to us, I think, is a big barrier for our understanding. It's a struggle for us to get out of our own human imaginations and relate to any animals, but because they're living underwater, it's an even bigger jump. And as someone who's worked in animal law for a long time, I still consider myself very ignorant of these animals and of this space. To learn today that cuttlefish have passed the marshmallow test is amazing to me. And if ever anybody doesn't know what that test is, it's basically you offer a creature a marshmallow and then sort of leave the room and say, you can eat that marshmallow or you can refrain from eating that marshmallow, and I'll come back in a little bit and give you 2 marshmallows. And toddlers struggle with this. But that's amazing to me, so we have so much to learn, and I think our ignorance is a very big barrier in this area. And then the other thing I would add, and I think this comes from, I've mostly looked at this from a climate lens. I think a big problem is that the industry, to the extent people think about it at all, they're hearing very positive messages from, speakers like international organizations, about how sustainable this activity is, the promise of blue foods, how necessary and positive this, supposedly is for food security. It's presented as a climate solution. So we have, this positive aura, this idea that this is some kind of an unmitigated good in the face of the very challenging future ahead. And I think that's a real challenge here as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So sounds like Kathy, please, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing really quickly to emphasize the scale conversation. So it's important to note not only that the scale of aquaculture has increased, but the scale at which people are consuming aquatic animals as food on the planet has increased. So our percentage of seafood, if you will, and our global population has increased. So those are 3 different levels of increase that aggregate, right, to make this problem a really huge and significant one we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely, thank you. So we have an issue of scale. We have an approach that is the opposite of the precautionary approach, starting before we have the available science, and this rhetoric narrative problem, all of which I think we'll pick up on later. Kathy, I have a further question for you. Given these challenges that we've started to identify, do you think the problem before us, or the task before us, is one to improve aquaculture or to move away and reduce aquaculture?
Yes, please. So we do need to do both, right? So we have aquaculture entrenched in some places. So the realities of aquaculture are quite different around the globe, depending on which species we're talking about, depending on just which jurisdiction you're in and how developed the industry is in particular places. So in some places, it's quite entrenched, and there we need to do a much better job of regulating and enforcing those regulations and trying to reduce the growth. But in other places, it hasn't been established yet, and there we have a tremendous opportunity that I think we are wasting as a community to prevent those capital investments in a broken industry. Right? And so I think we need to spend a lot more time educating our communities to say this is an opportunity to prevent significant amounts of suffering, and that we need to take time and attention to do that work.
A fantastic point. And we were hearing over the last couple of days at the UK Animal Law Conference about campaigns nationally to block, through planning law, new factory farming applications, which has been incredibly successful. So it seems there are routes within the legal field to do this sort of work. So it's great to hear. So my last question for this first part of the panel, is for all of you. So Kathy's spoken about sentience and the precautionary principle. Given what we know, how might we embed the needs, priorities, and wishes of the aquatic animals themselves centrally into our discussions throughout the day today? Do any of you have any thoughts on this?
Throughout the day, well, I'm certainly going to pick it up when I come back to talking about ethics. But I think when we're thinking about it in terms of a legal framework, which I know is the background a lot of you are coming from, I think beginning by simply recognizing aquatic animal sentience in some of our legal frameworks will be an important step forward. And we've seen the impact that can have in the UK with the recent legislation on sentience extending to aquatic animals, and now you are no longer allowed to boil lobsters alive in this country, which is a huge step forward. So I think, thinking about how, when we talk about all these issues going forward, how we make those issues concrete in our law, in our public discussions about animals, that will be central when we think about taking it beyond this room.
Yeah, I think that it's, I love this question. I think it's a great question that we should reflect on every time we talk about animal law, and I haven't been asked to do so before. I think trying to center the animals themselves, it's important for us to keep in mind how far the law has to go to deliver any kind of what we might call multi-species justice. I think when we're working on legal reform, I think trying to keep both concepts in mind at once, that we have so far to go for the law to actually deliver some form of justice to other beings. That's one concept. And then I think the other concept is, in the meantime, incremental change is available to us, and we should pursue it, and we should feel inspired by incremental change. We heard yesterday, as part of the UK Animal Law Conference, the Under Minister for Borders, Biosecurity, and Animals spoke to us, which, as an American, amazing that you have an Under Minister who has animals in her name. And then amazing to have her standing up in front of this group talking about methods of slaughter for decapods, talking about ending the cage age. This is the kind of change that we need to see to reach, ultimately where we would like to be. So that's what I would keep in mind today.
Thanks. Would you like to add, Kathy?
Yeah, really quickly, I think it's just broadening the conversation, right, and including more communities. So engaging more with the scientific community. We have a lot to learn from them, and they have a lot of valuable information that can support our work. And so the recognition scientifically that these animals can exist and can suffer, and we are harming them, and bringing that into the legal conversation. But even beyond that, that their capacities and capabilities are frustrated and harmed by the conditions in which they are maintained in captivity. And I think the sort of larger ethical conversation, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And we tend to aggregate to ourselves as humans that ability. And the collective view, I think, to consider also the indirect harms of this industry. So not only the other animals who are being used to feed these animals, but the other animals who would naturally feed on these animals, right? So we're talking about marine and freshwater animals, but also terrestrial animals who would eat, the bears who are eating salmon, and the orcas in the Pacific Northwest who are suffering and dying because there aren't enough salmon for them to eat because we are eating them. And so sort of that collective view that we are interconnected, right? These webs of life, and the harms, therefore, are interconnected and need to be deconstructed, and we need to see it, we need to be responsible for it, and we need to work to undo it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all. I would just briefly add that, Kathy, I think you've also helped us you've helped to visibilize these animals. You've spoken to how they are invisible. We have one of these beautiful animals on the screen right now, so we're able to use our visual sense. It's difficult in this room right now to use our other senses to imagine what these animals might want for themselves, but we do have the power of imagination, so I would invite everyone to do as much imagining of what these animals might wish for themselves today as you can. So that closes the first part of our panel. We have many experts in the room, and if any of you have insights or questions to add to this expositional discussion, please do hold on to them for the end of this panel. There'll be lots of time for that. But I'll now move us on to the second part of the panel, where we'll start talking about the impact of aquaculture on the environment and public health as well. So I'll now invite Daina to the stage for your presentation.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to focus on animal aquaculture and the climate. So as Iyan says, this is our first deep dive into one of the many harms. Kathy gave us a helpful overview. I'm not focused on climate because I think it is the only harm. We could spend a day on each one of these topics, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes on climate now. The perspective I bring to this is having led a project at Yale Law School on climate change and animal agriculture and what can be done through legal tools, particularly litigation and also policy, to start addressing the climate harms of animal agriculture. And in that project so far, we have focused entirely on terrestrial animal agriculture. So when Hira invited me to sort of do some thinking about climate and animal aquaculture, I was really excited for the opportunity to look at this industry and think about how is it the same or different than terrestrial animal agriculture. And in my work on terrestrial animal agriculture, this sort of, in broad strokes, the nature of the problem is that terrestrial animal agriculture is a huge driver of the climate crisis. Animal agriculture is responsible for something between 15 and 20% of all greenhouse gases. So think about that. That is a very significant share. We won't reach Paris Climate Agreement goals without addressing food systems alongside transportation and electricity. Animal agriculture is also a huge player for climate superpollutants like methane and nitrous oxide. So when I work on terrestrial animal agriculture, the sort of challenges that we're overcoming there are there's little awareness. The public doesn't really understand how their food choices drive climate change. There's very little policy in that area in terms of regulating the climate harms of animal agriculture. And then we have a very powerful industry that is actively engaged in these sort of their own public education efforts, many of which are you could describe as greenwashing and climate washing, and that's what we're trying to overcome. Now, taking some time to think about animal aquaculture and the climate, it's very much sort of a through the looking glass kind of moment for me. It's, whereas as to terrestrial animal agriculture, sort of thinking about fighting for awareness of these emissions, fighting the greenwashing by the companies, the issue when it comes to climate and animal aquaculture is it's this presentation of aquaculture as a climate solution. So it's a very sort of different orientation of the problem. Just to give you some examples of that, this is from the European Commission in its strategic guidelines for a more sustainable and competitive EU aquaculture guidelines for the period 2021 to 2030. And what you see here is the European Commission saying that aquaculture can help decarbonize the economy, fight climate change, and mitigate its impact. So it's very strong words from the European Commission. Here from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, they're starting by saying, you know, fish, it's not that bad. It's sort of comparable to chicken in its emissions. It's not as bad as pork and beef. And so, you know, we're going to conclude this activity, therefore, is only a minor contributor to emissions. So these are the kinds of messages that we're getting from, you know, key international organizations. And I want to talk about what are some of the problems with this framing. Before I do that, just some quick scene setting of how animal aquaculture contributes to climate change. One way is through feed production. This is the largest source of emissions from aquaculture. More than half of all emissions from animal aquaculture come from feed. Feed can be either crops grown to feed to fish or wild-caught fishes fed to fish. And in some species, feed production is up to 70% of emissions. You also see energy use, so that's for pumping water, aerating water, controlling the temperature of water. And then direct emissions, when you have unconsumed feed and waste in the water that is decomposing and releasing greenhouse gases. That happens in both marine environments and in ponds. And then, you know, sort of a less well understood mechanism for greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a critical one, is the land use change associated with these systems. So this happens in many ways. Soy is fed to farmed aquatic animals. Soy has been associated with deforestation and land use change, release of carbon. Growing crops to feed to aquatic animals entails what is called a carbon opportunity cost. So that means that we're using this land to grow crops, whereas if it were in a restored natural ecological situation, it would be sequestering and holding carbon. So because we're not using the land for a natural system, all of that opportunity to store carbon is lost to farming. Also, just the physical construction of fish ponds can disturb soils and ecosystems and release carbon. And there's particular examples of land use change that are very concerning from a climate perspective. One is the high rate of conversion of mangrove forests in Southeast Asia to fish ponds. So mangroves are critically important for the climate for a number of reasons. One is they serve as a sort of natural barrier to storms and extreme weather events. They're also exceptionally good at sequestering carbon. So when mangrove forests are converted to shrimp farms, and that's a very big loss for the natural carbon cycle. So that's how this works. What are the problems with like the FAO's description of aquaculture as only a minor contributor? The first is we don't even know really what these emissions are. So they can say it's a minor contributor, but it's really not well understood. These are sort of 4 available estimates from different groups of researchers, and you can see how much they vary across years. These are also incomplete estimates, each of them. They're described as cradle to farm gate, meaning that they include emissions from feed production and from rearing of fish, but they exclude post-farm emissions, so those land use change emissions I mentioned. Also transportation of products from the farm to market. So these are not complete estimates. They're also only as good as the inputs and the models that they're based on, and there's evidence that some of the information they're based on is incorrect. There's also very little actual field research to test the assumptions of these models. Really going out into the field and measuring greenhouse gas emissions it often yields very different results than researchers were assuming without doing that testing. And lastly, this is not nothing. Even if these are, the emissions from animal aquaculture, which they are not complete, that estimate in 2008, that was 5% of all global agricultural emissions that year. 2010, that was, no, that one was 7%. 2010 is 5%. So, it's not nothing, even at this level. The other thing is, I would say, the FAO, the comparison, like saying these are minor contributors because their emissions levels are like poultry, and they're less than pork and beef. There's a lot of problems with that. One is, this is a visualization of a really helpful study by Poor and Nemechek. And what you see here is that farmed fish and prawns are actually, in this study, showing as having higher emissions on average than pork. So that's not, the FAO, this contradicts the FAO's statement. Also, they say, of course, this is better than beef. Beef is, the most climate-intensive food of all. But there is research, for example, in the context of those mangrove forests being converted to shrimp farms. There's research that shows that, per kilogram of product, per kilogram of shrimp produced in those systems, Southeast Asia shrimp ponds that were converted from mangroves emitted more than 4.5 times the amount of greenhouse gases as converting the Amazon to beef pasture. So even in some cases, these systems can be more carbon intensive than beef. And then the other thing to point out here is, the FAO is comparing animal aquaculture and fisheries to other animal products. But look at what is the lowest climate impact of all of the foods. Those are plant-based foods. So I think that's the wrong framing of the problem, and it's the wrong comparison. Just also quickly to note, there's this assumption in the FAO's sort of optimism about this, that maybe by consuming more fish, then people are going to consume less of these higher, emitting, damaging foods. But there's no evidence to support that. As over the period that aquaculture production has increased, we've also seen increased consumption of those other climate-intensive terrestrial animal foods. So I think there's a lot of problems with the FAO's framing. It also ignores the significant climate variability across different types of animals. These are very variable systems. We're starting to get a sense of that already today. And basically, the climate intensity of these different systems has to do with what they're eating. The least climate intensive systems are at the bottom here, the unfed extractive species, meaning they're filter feeding from the environment. In the animal space, these are bivalves. And then becoming more climate intensive, fed omnivores and herbivores. So these are fish that are being fed, some sort of plant food. And then the most climate intensive species are fed carnivores that are fed other fish as fish meal or fish oil. So I think, painting aquaculture as this sort of, unified industry is, we really need to get at some of the complexities here if we want to understand the impacts. And then lastly, I'll just say that another problem of the framing of animal aquaculture in the climate context is, it's presented as part of our ability to adapt to the coming impacts of climate change. It's painted as positive for food security, but actually this is an intensely vulnerable activity to the effects of climate change. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has acknowledged that that aquaculture is one of the areas of human activity that is most exposed to the effects of climate change. How will climate change affect these systems? Increased water temperatures for cold-blooded animals who are highly sensitive to temperature change. Loss of dissolved oxygen in the water is detrimental and deadly to fish. Sea level rise will damage infrastructure for aquaculture. The ocean acidification is bad for fish. Changes in rainfall, changes in sea surface salinity. I mean, the way these environments are going to change, severe weather events cause death of animals, escapes, wild animal intrusion into ponds. The very way the ocean circulates is changing with climate change. And we're seeing algal blooms related to climate change and overall increased vulnerability to disease and mortality for aquatic animals. And I think this vulnerability to climate change undermines the characterization that this is part of our food security future. And as with all of climate change, the most vulnerable will be the most exposed, the beings who lack resources to adapt in the face of these coming challenges. That goes for animals, and it also goes for people. This, I thought, was quite compelling. It's a finding that the most extreme effects on climate change, those engaged in the aquaculture sector, the most extreme effects will be felt, of course, by poorer communities. So in sum, I think that policymakers should hesitate before they promote the expansion of animal aquaculture in the name of climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Daina. I think that was a strong and important message to end on. Claire, I'll now invite you to the stage for your presentation.
Great, thank you. I want to talk really about the ethics this morning, and it kind of feeds into everything we're talking about, but I think what ethics has to add to the conversation is hopefully a way of helping frame our legal arguments, but also our public debates about this, because legal arguments are informed by how the public feels. And so as Daina and Kathy have already indicated, the public is being told that the messaging around aquaculture is positive, that blue foods is something we should all be aspiring to, that they are sustainable, that they are good for us. And basically, although I'm going to prioritize animals in this discussion, because I'm an animal ethicist, I'm also going to talk about the ways in which it's problematic for humans to help us counter those kinds of arguments. So I'm going to divide it into 4 main areas, and I should say that I'm not really going to talk about the distinction between welfare and rights, which you might expect. Ethics kind of incorporates both, that's why I use the language, but also because I'd really like us to think about problematizing the idea that welfare is actually something that is possible for intensively farmed aquatic animals, because I just don't think it is. So there is no sense of real flourishing or a good life in any way possible for these animals, which is why I'll begin with talking about animal suffering. So this is important for a range of different reasons. As I mentioned earlier, when I was younger, people really talked about how fish didn't feel pain. Now, luckily, people really don't talk about that anymore, and that is because there is growing scientific evidence over the last 20 years which tell us increasing numbers of aquatic animals are sentient. What I mean by that is not just that the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, or that they have cognitive abilities. They use tools, they can recognize themselves, they have a wonderful list of capacities. But it's also that what we know about them is that they are capable of joy and fear, terror, foreboding, but also the positive emotions as well. So these animals are cognitively, psychologically, and socially complex. And we're only really at the tip of the iceberg of understanding them, because really science hasn't given it a lot of attention until relatively recently. So we are then putting into captivity these complex animals, and one of the things we haven't really talked about yet is that these animals are not domesticated, okay? In terrestrial animals, they have gone through processes over centuries and thousands of years to domesticate them, which means even if they're not used to necessarily the intensive conditions that they're in now, they are used to humans. They are used to being in environments with other humans. They are used to some form of restricted life. But you are taking extensively, although I don't like the word, wild, but free animals who are used to roaming huge distances and containing them. And the containment is really important here. So a salmon might, in the course of a year, travel up to 5,000 miles every year, which is a huge distance. Instead, you are containing somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 animals in one pen. The ability that frustrates them to live any form of natural life is unbelievable, right? So there is no sense of welfare that can be achieved there. And as Kathy said, they also eat each other because they are carnivorous. The other thing we haven't really talked about that much is that they escape. The aquaculture industry doesn't love to talk about this, but however advanced we've got in containing these animals, it's not sufficiently yet. And so you have instances of Atlantic salmon being bred in the Pacific Ocean, escaping, and then being in a whole ecosystem they shouldn't be, right? And that's not just about the animals themselves who are escaping, who don't know how to exist in that area. It's also about the ecosystem they're interacting with, and it's causing all kinds of issues, which we just aren't really talking about. The scale, again, is really about overcrowding and disease. Disease is one of the things I'm going to talk extensively about this morning, and one of the ways in which we deal with disease is by spraying the animals with formaldehyde, or formalin, as it is in its liquid form, to attempt to keep instances of bacteria and sea lice down. And although that doesn't help hinder human consumption, it is a big problem for worker safety. So public health is the other main thing I want to talk about. So I've already talked about formaldehyde and how that's an issue, but antibiotics are a huge issue. I know we've got used to the idea that antibiotics are used in industrial animal agriculture, but the reality is we only have a limited number of antibiotics we know work in humans. And we are risking our own human health by giving it to animals in this fashion. In the salmon farming industry in this country, in 2019, 5.6 million tons of antibiotics were used, which is a huge amount. And that is in an incredibly well-regulated area. I'll talk a lot about Scottish salmon farming today, but they are one area in which actually they've come a long way in regulating things. It's much worse in other parts of the world. So when we talk about the Scottish industry, we're really talking about the best, and it's still not great. What am I saying next? Heavy metals. This is another way in which humans are harmed by eating fish, farmed fish especially. So fish assume into their bodies everything that is in the feed and the water around them. This includes heavy metals such as lead, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, all of which are carcinogens. This includes the bioaccumulation of toxins such as DDT and PCBs, all of which are endocrine disruptors and cause neurological diseases. And we also know that they are ingesting huge amounts of microplastics. The microplastics come from the feed because you're collecting other animals who have already eaten the plastics, and then those animals eat the plastics, but it's also in the nets, it's in the pens, it's in the ways in which they're treated. And so humans are then ingesting them. So one study suggested that if you just ate Vietnamese seafood, you might consume something like 22,000 microplastics a year by doing that. And they are not only endocrine disruptors, but we also just don't know the long-term effects of plastic on the human body. But we do know that all of these things are linked to cardiovascular disease, reproductive issues, especially mercury in the fish, and neurodegenerative diseases. Some of that has been mapped onto the rise of Parkinson's that people are trying to explain. It might be related to the eating of fish. Worker safety is a thing we probably haven't got time to talk about extensively as we should, but I do want to say that it's a really big issue. It's actually one of the most dangerous industries to work in. The Scottish salmon industry in the past 5 years has 139 instances of broken bones, amputations, and what they call serious injuries, and one person has died. But in Chile, over the last 13 years, 90 people have died. And of course, that's a lot less, and that's well regulated as they consider it, but it's still an incredibly harmful process to the humans involved in it. And what's more, they are often this is not a desirable job, and so this is often low-skilled, low-paid, highly hazardous jobs. And so from a class analysis alone, this is very poor. We have a huge number of environmental issues, but Daina's talked about them, so I will skim over them. Pollution, dead zones. So that is a sea pen, and I don't know if you can see in the light, but the sea pen itself is more brown than the surrounding area. of ocean, and that's because all of the poop and the antibiotics and the feed sink to the bottom, and the eutrophication of the sea around it. So we're actually polluting the areas around the sea pens. As everybody's mentioned already, overfishing is an environmental issue because we are taking already free-living animals and feeding them to the farmed carnivorous animals. The impact on marine life in general has already been covered, and climate change, I'm not going to go on about that because Daina did that. The last things I really want to talk about is that I think aquaculture is often sold as an economic benefit. It's going to have this many jobs, right? But we don't think about the jobs that are being displaced. That happens. And actually, whatever you think about normal, traditional fishing, a lot of those fishers in local areas are traditional family fishing businesses. They have fished the seas in a traditional way for hundreds of years. That's a lot of skill passed down through their family businesses. And those businesses are displaced when an aquaculture industry comes in because they privatize the land on the coast, and they compete for resources and fish, and those do not necessarily employ those local fishermen, because instead they employ lower paid, lower skilled workers who they can put in greater harm's way. So so the argument economically is suspect, and that really should be challenged. We've already talked about it being an inefficient food system production. I want to say again about how offshore aquaculture in particular is out of sight. I think we've talked about how we don't encounter the animals, and so we don't have a relationship with them, and that's true. But also, this is what you might see from the coast. You might not actually know what's happening. And if you don't know what's happening, it's incredibly hard to challenge it. And I think that that is one of the things that's really important about this kind of symposium, is we're bringing attention to an issue that is often unseen. And lastly, which relates to that, which I know some of you are already working on, yay, compassion, is labeling. The reality is that even if you decided you didn't want to eat farmed fish, in most parts of the world, it isn't labeled as farmed fish. You don't know what you're eating. So we are not empowering consumers to make ethical choices. And so we're not enabling ourselves to move that issue forward. So labeling is one of the things I wanted to bring into the discussion. Okay, I've probably gone over 10 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. So I think we have a really good and broad informational or informative base for our conversation now. So we've got some time now to hear further from all of our panelists about the issues that have been raised this morning. I'd like to start by saying that the starting point for a conversation about improving aquaculture regulation, which we'll be talking about today, really ought to be information about what the animals involved are experiencing. And we've heard quite a bit about this from all three of you already. But I'd like to ask, generally speaking, do you think at the moment we have the information we need, or are there important gaps in terms of information about the industry itself, the environmental impacts, and the human communities that are impacted as well? This question's for anyone who would like to take it.
I can begin. And one of the things I want to just sort of emphasize again is that we're speaking today in generalities, because these systems look different depending on the species and the jurisdiction. And this. So just understand that with everything we're saying. But yes, so I would say two things about the data. So one, we have enough data to know that we're causing harm. Right? We're causing harm in all the ways that we've been discussing. And two, we need more data. So we are getting some data from nonprofit organizations who are doing undercover, and that is the way that we made inroads into regulation for the terrestrial farming context, and we need to do that here. So we need more data to be able to show people, to make visible what is happening to these animals. because it's beyond human imagination, right? If you haven't experienced it, and to know what's happening to the environments and to the communities and people who are impacted by this, as well as to know what's happening to the other animals in the ecosystems who are impacted by this. So we definitely need more data. I think we certainly have sufficient data that we can be regulating, but that's my opinion. It may not be what a legislator thinks is sufficient.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we need more data. And I agree that we also have enough data to act. But I also want to say about the data we have is that a lot of the data comes from the industries themselves, right? And that's not to talk about corruption or anything, but it is to say that the people who, even scientists in this field, who want to make, let's say, a quantitative analysis of how many antibiotics are used or whatever, they rely on the self-reporting. So a lot of the peer-reviewed important science you read on the thing, read on the issue, comes from the industry itself. And so since the industry in large parts of the world is unregulated, even the data we have, right, isn't good. But it could be much worse than that. We just don't know. And so I think a healthy suspicion towards some of that is helpful. In my experience, I've been attempting to try and get a lot of environmental scientists to write on this issue, and some of them don't want to talk about it, at least in part because they rely on the industry to get the information they have to write the things they're able to write. So they don't want to be critical or more critical than they need to be. So, yeah, I want to say that.
Yeah, and I would just add, using climate as an example, we absolutely do not have enough information, certainly not enough information to conclude that this is a climate solution. And some of the problem is exactly what Claire is saying about, I mentioned that feed is the largest part of emissions from animal aquaculture. And, data on what these animals are being fed is largely coming from industry. There's no regulation that requires them to disclose what's being fed. And so that's one of the sort of the bases on which the available estimates, is founded. Also, when there's studies done challenging some of these assumptions underlying the modeling of the environmental intensity of these systems, it can come with, arrive at really results that are very much in contrast to the assumptions. So for example, Jennifer Jacquet and others at NYU did a study looking at this issue of what's called fish in, fish out in the industry. So looking at, how much fish you have to feed to these carnivorous animals to get, biomass out of the fish that is then slaughtered, and found in that study, because the assumptions that the prior models were built on, there were all sorts of fish mortality events that were overlooked by those models and other things overlooked, found values up to 300% higher for fish in, fish out for some species than was previously understood. So I think there is a profound lack of data, and it's leading us to underestimate the effects of these systems.
Thank you, Daina. Thank you all. I think that's really helpful, and I have a brief follow-up about the information that we have. Claire, I'm curious, how do you think the increasing scientific evidence we have about the sentience of the aquatic animals involved should change how we think about aquaculture?
Well, I think in fairness, you have to say at some point when these industries began, they knew that they could do this, but they perhaps didn't have the scientific evidence to show why they shouldn't. I think sentience alone ought to be enough to indicate that we shouldn't be doing this. And so I think it's a really strong point. Suffering is something that A, the public cares about, and B, legislators care about. And I think it should be enough to change our laws. And so really anything where we can talk about sentience in the law, but talk about it in terms of suffering and individual suffering, I think should help change how we perceive it. But also then, as I indicated, I think there's also human suffering involved here and environmental suffering. So, and I think the language we use to talk about it is really important in that regard.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you, Claire. So I've asked a few questions about the information that we have. I'd like to move on to talking about processes to make change. First of all, a question for the whole panel. What principles do you think should guide policymakers in seeking to develop policy to address the environmental and ethical objections we might have to animal aquaculture?
I feel so narrow. I'm just going to speak to climate because that's what I have something to say about. First, as a policy matter, both on land and at sea, we should be prioritizing investment in plant-forward systems for all of the reasons. We should be investing in livelihood transitions for folks who are reliant on these systems. If animal aquaculture is deemed necessary in a particular context, I think some of the policy principles from a climate perspective that emerge for me is that farming of these most climate intensive groups of animals should be deprioritized in favor of less climate and environmentally intensive groups of animals, such as bivalves. If you're looking from a climate perspective, again, Jennifer Jacquet and others wrote a paper entitled "Bivalves Are Better" from an environmental perspective, and they are. We should also protect key areas for carbon sequestration, so mangroves, seagrass beds. It's a lot more efficient and effective to protect an existing ecosystem than it is to try and restore one that has already been destroyed. And there are wonderful mangrove restoration projects going on around the world, but that's just not the right way to go about it from a climate perspective or an ecosystem health perspective. I say this as to terrestrial animal agriculture as well. These emissions should be regulated. The emissions should be regulated in the same way that emissions from other industries are regulated. They are not. This is part of the exceptional treatment of agriculture in the environmental law around the world. Even if there is not political feasibility to directly regulate emissions from these industries right now, government should start with disclosure and monitoring and inspection. We keep coming back to we don't know enough about what is happening, and that would be a good start. Disclosure of the actual feed we already talked about. Disclosure of fertilizer use. This would help us assess the real impacts of these systems on the climate and other public goods. And finally, there's almost no good, reliable information about the amount of subsidies that are provided to these industries. Subsidies can come in the form of direct payments, disaster relief. As I mentioned, these systems are very vulnerable to extreme weather events, and infrastructure investments. Some of these systems they're so expensive to set up, they rely on public taxpayer investments. We should understand what those investments are so that our policymakers can make better decisions about where we're putting our money to build the best future for us in terms of climate and everything else.
Thank you, Daina.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that, except that I would like to add that I think the beginning should be no more. If you are a policymaker, I think we should begin by saying the number of aquaculture facilities we have are the limit, right? And we should be looking at decreasing the amount we have and transitioning away from them. And I think the reality is that the financial push towards the blue foods industry means that these are increasing. So we should begin by simply ending subsidies. And if we're going to have blue foods, they should be plant-based. Because I think the environmental effects of plant-based aquatic aquaculture is much, much less. And so we could begin there. But I really think from a policy perspective, we just have to draw a line at some point. There are enough now.
Yeah, I would echo that and say that the way in which we regulate ourselves, right, is obviously a dysfunctional sort of system. But if you think about the fact that everywhere in the world, human waste is both managed and regulated, right? We have systems, and we have systems because we realized not to do so was a problem, right? And we learned that a long time ago. So this is exceptionalism is striking, except it's predictable because we live in societies where we want to give people the autonomy to do things unless they've already exist in a system where it's regulated, right? So we want to give people, you get to do what you want to do. You can create a new business, you can do all kinds of things, and if there's no regulation that says you can't, you can't. So that's the regulatory system. We don't have experience traditionally with aquaculture, right? So there's only a few sort of systems in the world where this has been practiced traditionally. So some in China, some in Hawaii. And those were very different, right? Those were like, fish might be coming down a stream from a mountain, and then there would be a segregated pool where they would capture, some of the fishes that would still be fed by the nutrients in the water of the stream, and the waste would still go downstream, and it would be still in the same sort of number of fishes, basically, that would be living in that stream, right? And then those fishes would be slaughtered and eaten. But they were part of and still integrated into the natural system, and the relationship between the people and the animals was very similar. So we've deconstructed that entirely, lifted species and put them in places where they don't belong, in systems that they can't exist in. So I think the first step is letting people know, first of all, that this happens, right? People still don't know that it happens. And then when you tell people that this is happening, most folks assume there's already some laws to manage it. And so letting them know that is not also the case. And then maintaining that the laws should actually reflect our scientific understanding of these animals, right? These beings and their capacities and needs. And then making clear that the law can only do so much, right? The law is, to Claire's point, only going to marginally improve, right, the lives of these beings. It cannot eliminate the suffering. It won't stop that. And to then regulate the industry, right? If companies want to be selling these products to the community, they need to have some oversight, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be data sharing, and there needs to be regulation. And obviously one of the issues we always have in the animal community is in that enforcement of whatever it is we've decided we want to do, which is a significant challenge.
Great, thank you. As a very brief follow-up, do you think there are any particular tools, whether in technology, law, or policy, that we should really be focusing on in our efforts to make change here, very briefly?
So I'll say very quickly that AI is something to watch out for. It is being used to exploit these animals to their maximal potential, and that is unbelievably troubling. And so there is some conversation, obviously, about optimizing welfare with the use of AI, but in this context, it's doing exactly the opposite, and we need to be very, very attentive to that.
Thanks, Kathy. Anything you would like to add, Daina or Clair?
Just that I think that we're hearing a lot about regulation, and regulation is one tool, and of course enforcement and compliance are another's within that. But I do think, as consumers and as members of the public, we have the ability to ask for more than simply regulation. We have the ability to ask to regulate it to the extent that it might be economically unviable. That is, after all, what's happened in a lot of places with fur farming and other things. So if we want to make change and we want to make regulatory change, let's make the standards so high that they can't actually meet them. Or that it becomes, again, what once was a luxury product. Because 50 years ago, this many people were not eating salmon. And if that number of people eating salmon on a regular basis comes down, that will be inordinately better for the animals, for the planet, and for us.
Great. So thank you all. I'd like to wrap up this conversation by speaking very briefly to the potential outcomes that we might hope for, or that we could aim toward. Kathy, I'm wondering, could you share whether there are any encouraging updates regarding aquaculture regulation that we can look to for inspiration?
Yeah, so there are some. So the good news is that there are a number of jurisdictions in the United States, so California and the state of Washington have put some bans in place, but there are local bans and some national bans around the world. of certain kinds of aquaculture production systems, right? So again, speaking sort of in generalities. There are communities who are rising up and saying, not in our community. There are fisher folk saying, we don't have, there aren't even enough fish for us to sustain our communities anymore. So there is a growing awareness, and that's a wonderful thing. There is, and this is not as good, but there is growing regulation, there is growing recognition of the need for governments to actually address the welfare concerns that are raised by these systems. Not that they're doing it in satisfactory ways, but the fact that they're actually taking on that task is a good thing. And so there are different organizations around the world who are working, lots of animal advocates. There's a lot more attention being paid, which is really wonderful. Claire and I are working with others in this room on a report to ban octopus farming as a global effort. So there are some positive things that folks can take away.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. As a final rapid-fire question for all three panelists, I would love to know if you think there is one way that we could act in order to think about these issues in a multi-species way, decentering the human, attributing significance to more than human perspectives, and attending to interconnections between different forms of life on Earth. What would it be? An easy low-ball one to finish us off.
I mean, I'll just start by saying beginning to literally see these animals and share that experience with others, right? Lifting them up to the visible sphere, calling them out as beings, as our cousin, as our kin, in whatever language works for people, and just raising the issue that they have welfare to be considered.
Yeah, you know, as part of that, I think helping to spread the word about what we are doing to these animals. You know, it's so the aquaculture is not well understood by most folks. You know, in the climate sphere, one of the reasons that climate change is so concerning is because of this concept of climate tipping points. So that's where you have an increased temperature that affects a large part of the climate system in such a way that change becomes irreversible. And it's something that scientists have been looking for. Think like melting of ice sheets or thawing of permafrost. And in a very sad development, scientists looking at this think that we've reached our first climate tipping point at the end of last year, and that was widespread die-off of warm water coral reefs. This is such a tragedy, and I don't think, you know, it's part of this, like, the underwater world being hidden from us. I don't even think people know about that or are reacting to that. And what this means is that if warming continues, and there's every reason to think that it will because we're not hitting our mitigation goals, reefs are gone. You know, these beautiful ecosystems on which a quarter of all marine life depends are dying. And we're not talking about it. So I think whatever we can do to spread the word and open our eyes to what we're doing to these animals that live under the water is helpful.
Yeah, and I think from a straight ethical perspective, might doesn't equal right. It's a simple notion, but the idea that humans are not the center of this planet or even the center of this universe, and that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. We exist in an incredibly delicate balance, and there are other beings with lives that matter to themselves, you know, interests to themselves, and the more we can enmesh ourselves in understanding and respecting and appreciating and adopting an air of wonder and awe towards other beings that inhabit the planet, the more we will move away from a human-centered focus of life.
Great. I think these are all really important messages. So before we move to our Q&A, I'd like to say thank you so much to our panelists for all the insights that you have shared with a brief round of applause. Thank you all. So we have some time for Q&A now. Can I check how much time we do have?
Why don't we go to 10:35 since we started late?
Sure. So we have just about 10 minutes. So just to remind everyone that we are recording today's session, and that recording will be shared later, so be mindful of that in your Q&A. Megan, if you'd like to pass the mic.
Hello, I'm Lena Northwood. I am what I am, God knows. So I'm working. I gave a talk this week on modelling fish welfare law using AI. I've spent the last 3 years working with people in aquaculture and in travelling 8 countries last year, 7 countries this year, and my research has gone over 10 countries, and I spoke to 27 fish welfare experts.
Can you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
I spoke to 27 fish welfare experts across 10 different countries about their feelings about that in research, exotics, aquaria, and everything. So, first of all, I will say that I do agree with everything that you're saying. I recognise these positions and everything, but it's taken me 3 years to come to an understanding of where aquaculture sits in this argument at this time. And for me, this is not for me to be combative, it's just simply to put another viewpoint forward at this time, and I hope that you'll respect my thoughts on this sort of thing. I agree, plan forward, but the protein intake of the world is increasing 6 to 8% every year, so the reality is going in a different direction. I wish that were different. I have just recently been promoting carp as vegetarians over the fact that that salmon are carnivorous, and it's ridiculously inefficient, and the use of all of those sort of things. But they're still moving in that thing. I live in Tasmania. I live about 3 kilometres from a salmon farm, and I have interacted with the people there. Some of them are very, very horrible. Many of them are very nice. And the way that these people that I'm dealing with are starting to become more compassionate, the younger people, towards and understanding fish as individuals and not wanting them to suffer, and speaking to people on that. So for me, I do think it's going in a better direction. I don't agree with open net sea pens. I think they are, but I've seen all of the ways that they're going forward on that. They don't want their fish to die. They don't want their fish to suffer. It's not maximal. Actually, I spoke to a person in Norway recently. She said, we are now slowing down the growth of the fish so that they have better welfare, and that we can, but the problem is, of course, there's more impact on the environment when that's happening. She said, so we're really having to think about this, and I've seen it go down from around 5 kilograms per meal fish down to 2 kilograms. It is going in a better direction. It's not a perfect system. I don't agree with it. But when I see what happens in commercial fisheries, and I see up to 70% bycatch happening, and I see the growth of this, then it's problematic for me. I also my question, I want to make sure yeah. So I expected to come into a balanced conversation here today. My question is, last point. There are over 1 million aquaculture farms in China. This is a very big deal, and it's growing. And there are people in Canada, Indigenous people, who don't want to shut aquaculture down. I would just like to ask everybody whether there's going to be a balanced approach to this, and a recognition that there is much, much worse out there, which is the commercial fishing, and I do think that it's going in the right direction to go offshore. So is there going to be a balance here?
So the problem is that the addition of aquaculture is additive. It's on top of the commercial fishing, and it relies on commercial fishing to feed the industry. So the problem with industrialized farming of any sort, terrestrial or aquaculture, is that it's not sustainable. It's much better to grow the plants to feed to the humans rather than grow the plants to feed to the animals, to kill them, to feed to the humans. It is not a sustainable system. There is no future prediction, whether it's climate concerns or other concerns, that say this is sustainable. At the rate we're going, right, we're gonna fish all the fish in the sea, and that's a problem. So this is just not sustainable. It's a question of when we realize that. So there are many angles, right? So people could be concerned the environmental side, the animal welfare side, the human side. But this is a destructive industry that we did not have, that is not actually solving the problems it intends or purports to solve. And we just need to get there faster. So whether it's a little bit better, this one or that one versus this or that is not really the ultimate question. We are creating new systems that create new harm in this myriad way that is unnecessary.
Yeah, and just to echo that, in my research and thinking about these issues, I'm always focused on industrial systems, as Kathy says. Like, I don't think that traditional indigenous aquaculture system should be the focus here. That's not, the industrial systems are the problem, and that's what I'm talking about, and I think that's what we should focus on, and I don't, I'm not directing these comments at indigenous traditional aquaculture systems.
Yeah, I think I was quite clear that I wasn't directing it at indigenous traditional fishers, but also, the reality is that these things are here. I'm not saying that we should, I was very clear that we shouldn't have any more, right? Okay, the ones that are here, and I believe they should be regulated more heavily than they are. But what you're experiencing is an enormous push towards not just what we have now, but an increased commercial aquaculture facilities all over the world. Okay, so we're not, even if we just stay where we are and say, some of these people, good people, some of them good, it's not judging the people. People come to practices as a community, because of how they're educated and because what we know. It is our job as academics and as people engaged in a public debate about things to educate people that wherever we are, we can all do better,
And I just want to add really quickly that when we talk about animal welfare, it's really important to know the source of the science. And so there's an entire industry for animal welfare within captivity, right, within captive industries. And the questions are asked, what can be the best animal welfare within that system? That is not animal welfare. That is animal captivity welfare. Animal welfare is what is the best, thriving for this particular animal in their natural setting. And those are really different questions. And just to point out that there's tension between those two, right? And to acknowledge that we probably are speaking about the one and others might be thinking we're speaking about the other.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
It is? Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm still Aquaculture 101, so my question might be yes. So I'm learning and also observing the intersectionality of aquaculture under, let's say, Ministry of Agriculture. I'm using my ministries, and also Ministry of Environment. So recently what happened in my country is that because of the different ministries trying to pursue different agendas from the same species, they ended up putting fish in the parks under the environment, and fish that's agriculture under Ministry of Agriculture. But still, we are still at that same problem of there's no legislation, there's no policy with regards to aquaculture. And we also did a baseline survey and also still are trying to solve the issue of coming up with regulations for fish and aquaculture in general. So my question was maybe the strategic angle on how to deal with this, because you still find that poachers and people involved in poaching fish for commercial purposes are now falling under the wildlife industry, yet they're also, so I'm just asking on the strategic way when formulating policies and laws when it's a two-pronged approach like that.
I'll just start really quickly, and I know we have very little time left. And so it can get even more complicated because there's often departments of fisheries. And so I think the challenge or the advice might be starting sort of where Claire started. We are where we are. So having conversations with those communities and trying to show the intersectionality and say, we need to co-regulate, or someone has to give up some of their authority to shift to another department. Those are difficult conversations, and they'll be very jurisdiction and culturally based, but trying to bring everyone to the table to let them know that this is happening and that there's a question to be addressed.
Thank you, Kathy. Shall we try and take one very quick final question? Yeah? Thank you.
Hi, my question's for Daina. You mentioned this towards the end of your presentation, but the impact that climate change has on aquaculture. I was just wondering, we're trying to do that in one of our projects for dairy. Instead of going after dairy, saying dairy is bad for climate change, we're saying climate change is bad for dairy to make the argument more palatable for policymakers. And I was wondering if you think that's a good approach in systems where aquaculture is deeply entrenched. So trying to appeal to policymakers to regulate aquaculture and to regulate the welfare of animals in aquaculture, and I understand there are questions about that, but simply talking more about and doing more research about how climate change is going to affect this sector and building a narrative that this is not sustainable. Because if it is vulnerable to climate change, it is certainly not sustainable, and that is a narrative we can argue for.
I absolutely do think that that's an effective way to go about it, and I think there's, and I'm happy to chat with you later, I think there's quite a lot of research and scholarship already that is showing not only will these systems face these impacts, but they already are facing these impacts. And I know, all well and good to be working on food security for communities, but you're really setting people up for a very bad situation if, sea levels rising and all this other stuff. So I'd love to chat more about that.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for some really thought-provoking questions. Thank you again to our panel for a wonderful start to the day. I'll pass over to Megan now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note, because I don't think we did, Laurie Beyranevand from Vermont Law and Graduate School was unexpectedly unable to join us today. We are going to try to get a recording of her presentation, and we will share that afterwards. And thank you. It was a wonderful foundation.